Snow hissed against the curved iron wall, and inside the dark of the ruined silo, a girl pressed her back to the cold metal, counting her own breaths to stay calm. She did not yet know that beneath her frozen boots, under a skin of rotted plank, a sealed room had waited 60 years for someone exactly this desperate to find it. 3 winters earlier, her grandmother had set a single seed potato on the windowsill and said, "What looks like nothing is only nothing if you stop looking." June had rolled her eyes then. She was 15, certain that wisdom was just something old people said to fill silence. But the old woman only smiled, tucked the wrinkled potato into June's palm, and folded her fingers over it. "Everything worth having," she said, "starts as something everyone else walks past." By 18, June Halloway had walked past a great many things herself, and a great many things had walked past her. Her grandmother was 2 years in the ground. The small rented house had gone to the bank within a season, sold to pay debts June had never been told about. There were no other relatives, or none who answered letters, and the county had decided she was old enough to be nobody's problem. She had learned to be small. She kept her dark hair cropped short because it was easier, carried everything she owned in a canvas army surplus pack, and moved through the towns of the northern plains like weather, never staying long enough to be noticed or pitied. She took day work where she could find it, washing dishes, stacking feed sacks, mucking stalls, and slept where the wind couldn't reach her. What set June apart, though she didn't yet know to value it, was how she looked at things. Where others saw junk, she saw parts. Where others saw a dead garden, she saw soil that only needed turning. Her grandmother had taught her to read weather in the way cattle stood, to know good dirt by its smell, to mend, to graft, to save seed in twists of waxed paper. These were not skills anyone paid for. They lived in June like a language no one around her spoke. The trouble had started in the town of Ashfork, where she'd spent her last dollars on bread and been told, by a man named Hollis Pruitt, who owned half the main street, that drifters weren't welcome to linger. He ran the granary, the lumber yard, and a good portion of the county's debts, and he liked his town tidy. June was not tidy. She was a loose thread, and men like Pruitt pulled loose threads. So she had walked out of Ashfork on the old county road with a storm coming up purple behind her. No plan beyond getting clear of his reach before dark. The land out here was empty in the way only abandoned land is empty. Fence lines sagging, a fallow field gone to thistle, and at the edge of it, black against the bruised sky, the broken silhouette of a grain silo that no one had filled in a generation. She did not want it. She wanted a warm room and a locked door and a life that belonged to her. But the snow was already in her collar, and the silo was there, and need is a practical thing. The door had rusted half off its track, and she squeezed through into a darkness that smelled of dust and old grain, and mice. June clicked on her failing flashlight. The beam was weak, but it showed her enough. A round iron room, a litter of fallen boards, a wooden floor swollen and buckled by 60 years of leaks. She set down her pack, meaning to wait out the night against the wall. Then she stepped toward the center to lay out her bedroll, and the floor spoke, a long, tired groan of wood that had finally been asked too much. June froze. Too late. The plank beneath her right boot folded like wet cardboard, and then the whole rotten span gave way at once, and she was falling, pack and flashlight and all, down into a black square of cold air that should not have existed beneath an empty field. She landed hard on something that was not dirt. For a moment June lay still in total darkness, taking inventory of her body the way her grandmother had taught her to take inventory of a wounded animal, slowly, without panic. Ankles, wrists, ribs, head, sore, whole. The flashlight had rolled somewhere to her left, its beam pointing at a wall, and what the beam showed made no sense. Concrete, smooth, poured, deliberate concrete, with a steel shelf bracket bolted into it. She crawled to the light and lifted it. The room resolved around her, in slow pieces, and each piece made her heart beat harder. She was sitting on a poured floor, maybe 12 feet square. The walls were concrete reinforced with steel. Above her, the jagged hole she'd fallen through let down a thin gray column of snowlight 10 feet up, and lining the walls, rank on rank, were steel shelves. The shelves were not empty. Her first thought was that she had broken into something she would be punished for, that this belonged to someone, that men would come. The old fear. She almost turned the light off, as if darkness could put her back outside. But the cold, practical part of her, the part her grandmother had built, kept the beam moving. Cans, hundreds of cans, dull gray and sealed, stacked in careful rows, glass jars of something pale, wooden crates stenciled with faded military lettering, a workbench against the far wall with tools hung on a pegboard, everyone in its painted silhouette, coils of wire, a hand crank device she didn't recognize, and on a shelf all its own in tins sealed with wax, row after row labeled in a careful hand, seed corn, seed bean, seed squash, seed wheat. June sat back on her heels and tried to think. Part of her wanted to climb out immediately. This place was strange, and strange things had owners, and owners meant trouble like Pruitt. She had survived 3 years by wanting nothing, claiming nothing, leaving no trace. To want this, to even imagine it hers, was to risk the particular pain of having something taken away. But the snow was howling somewhere above. She had $11 and a heel of bread. Winter had only started, and she had nowhere, truly nowhere, to be. She thought of the seed potato folded into her palm. What looks like nothing is only nothing if you stop looking. She wasn't looking at nothing. She was looking at a year of life, maybe more, sealed away and forgotten beneath a field everyone had given up on. The only question was whether she was brave enough to call it hers. June stayed. She told herself it was only for the storm, only until morning, but she was already unrolling her bedroll on the dry concrete, already prying the lid from a tin marked simply biscuit. Inside, sealed under wax paper, were hard crackers that smelled of nothing but flour and thyme. She ate two. They were stale beyond stale. But they were food she had not paid for with the last of anything. That night, wrapped in her blanket with the wind shut out, she did something she had not done in 2 years. She made a list in her head of things she could do tomorrow, instead of merely things she had to survive. When she finally slept, it was deep, and she did not dream of leaving. The boy found her on the third day. She had gone up at dawn to scout the field and met a thin figure of perhaps 11. Swallowed in a man's coat, setting rabbit snares along the fence, he froze like a deer. She froze too. For a long moment they only looked at each other across the frozen thistle. "You live in the broke silo?" he finally asked. "Maybe," June said. "I'm Wesley," he said. "I won't tell. Pruitt took our farm too. He said the name the way you'd name a weather that had ruined you, and something in June, long shut, opened the width of a door. What followed were the strangest, brightest weeks of June's life. The bunker, she came to understand, had been built by a frightened, methodical man in the years, when the whole country had been frightened, and some men answered fear by digging. Stenciling on the crates gave her a year, 1957, and a sensibility. Whoever he was, he had not merely hidden food. He had hidden a way of living. There were manuals in oilcloth, their pages still crisp, explaining how to store grain against weevils, how to render tallow, how to keep seed viable through the cold in sealed tins with a twist of dry charcoal. She read them by lantern light. There were 3 lanterns and a crate of fuel. The way other girls her age might have read letters from someone who loved them. She inventoried everything. It took 4 days. By the end, she had filled the back pages of a found ledger with her careful columns. 211 cans of meat and vegetables, their seams still tight. 40 pounds of salt. A sealed barrel of hard wheat. Coils of copper and steel wire. A complete set of hand tools, oiled and perfect bolts of canvas. A hand-cranked grain mill in a wooden case. Fishing line, hooks, 50 steel traps, and the seed. Always she came back to the seed. Corn and beans and squash and wheat and a dozen kinds of vegetable, each tin labeled, each variety chosen by a man who had clearly known what he was doing. Most seed that old would be dead. June knew that, but her grandmother had taught her the test, and on the fifth morning she folded 10 corn kernels into a damp cloth and set it near the lanterns. Warmth, and waited. She did not wait alone. Wesley came most days now, slipping out from the tar paper house 2 miles off where he lived with a sick mother and no money and a great deal of unspoken hunger. June did not ask after his situation directly. She had been on the wrong end of pity too often to inflict it. Instead, she put him to work, which is a different and better thing. Hold the light steady, she'd say, or sort those by size, or tell me if these beans rattle dry or soft. And Wesley, who was used to being a burden, discovered that here he was useful, and bloomed under it like a plant brought in from frost. On the seventh day, the corn sprouted. June unfolded the cloth, and there they were. 7 of the 10 kernels split white, pale roots curling out blind and certain toward life. She actually laughed out loud, a sound that startled her in the concrete quiet. 7 of 10. 60-odd years sealed in wax and dark, and 7 of 10 had woken up. The man who'd chosen this seed had chosen it for keeping, and it had kept. "That's good?" Wesley asked, watching her face. "That's everything," she said, because now it was not just a buried pantry that would empty itself by spring. Now it was a beginning. 200 cans would feed 2 people through a winter. But seed that lived, seed that could be planted, grown, saved, and planted again, that would feed people forever. Her grandmother's voice was very close that morning. Everything worth having starts as something everyone else walks past. They made a plan, June and the boy, hunched over the ledger like conspirators. The field above was fallow but not dead. June had smelled the soil and found it tired but willing, the kind of ground that only needed turning and feeding and a season's patience. The silo would be their cover. No one came here. No one wanted a broke-down silo on land Pruitt had let go to Thistle because the title was tangled in some old dispute, and he hadn't bothered to clear it. That tangle, June thought, might be the most valuable thing of all, though she did not yet know how much. For now there was work, and work was a kind of joy she had forgotten. She and Wesley cleared the fallen floor from the bunker hole and built a proper ladder from cratewood. They rigged a hatch that could be covered with planks and old thistle so that from above the silo floor looked merely broken, not opened. They hauled the grain mill up and ground wheat into coarse flour, and June baked flat bread on a sheet of bunker steel over a small, careful fire, and the smell of it filled the iron silo like a had finally let out. She had spent 3 years owning nothing so that nothing could be taken. Now, kneeling in lamplight over trays of seedlings, she let herself want. It was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. Winter loosened its grip slowly, the way it does on the northern plains, false springs and hard returns, mud 1 week and ice the next. June used the cold time well. She could not plant the field yet, but she could prepare, and preparation was something the bunker had been built to reward. She started seedlings indoors, down in the steady, cool bunker where the lantern warmth and a row of glass jars made a kind of nursery. She filled tins and cut down cans with soil hauled bucket by bucket from the field, and into them went the woken seed. Corn first, then beans. Then the squash that her grandmother had always said was a poor family's salvation, because it stored all winter and asked for nothing but room to sprawl. The seedlings rose pale and then greened as she rigged reflectors from polished can lids to throw more light. Wesley named them. He named every single seedling, which June found ridiculous and did not stop him from doing. Above ground, when the weather allowed, they worked the field. June had no horse and no plow, but she had 50 steel traps worth of patience and a man's complete set of hand tools, and she had read the oilcloth manuals until she knew them by heart. She and Wesley dug a kitchen garden first, a quarter-acre, no more, sized to what 2 people could tend by hand. They turned the tired soil and fed it with what they had: ash from their fires, bone meal ground in the mill from the bones of Wesley's snared rabbits, the rich black rot from under the old thistle. June tested the dirt by smell and by taste and by the worms that came back to it, and slowly, week by week, The quarter acre changed from gray to brown to something dark and alive. Wesley's mother got a little better as the food got a little steadier. June never went to the house, but she sent things, a can of meat here, a sack of ground flour there, a jar of the bunker's pale honey that turned out to be sugar syrup gone thick but still sweet. She sent them through Wesley and never spoke of it, and Wesley never thanked her in words. Because both of them understood that to name a kindness is sometimes to make it a debt, and they were building something that had no debts in it. In the long evenings, she taught him. This surprised her as much as anything. She taught him to read the manuals, sounding out the long words, and to figure the columns in the ledger, and to test seed in a damp cloth, and to graft a slip of one apple branch onto another so that a single wild tree at the field's edge might be made to bear something worth eating. She taught him the way her grandmother had taught her, not by lecturing, but by handing him the thing and standing close while he learned it with his hands. "Where'd you learn all this?" he asked one evening, packing soil around a squash start. "My grandmother," June said. "She knew how to see things." "See what?" June considered. "Worth," she said finally. "In stuff people throw away. In ground people give up on." She tamped a seedling firm. "In people, I guess." Wesley went quiet, and June pretended not to notice that he had to wipe his face on his sleeve, because some kindnesses you do by looking away. By the time the last frost lifted, June knew it had lifted by the way the cattle 2 farms over lay down in the open instead of bunching against the cold. She had 140 strong seedlings ready, hardened off by careful days set outside in the sun and brought in at night. She had a prepared bed of dark living soil. She had a boy who had learned to work, and a buried storehouse that had given them everything its frightened maker had sealed away. They planted on a clear morning in late April. June showed Wesley how deep, how far apart, how to firm the soil and water from a can with the rows turned up so the stream wouldn't wash the roots bare. They planted corn in blocks so it would pollinate, beans to climb the corn, squash to sprawl beneath and shade out weeds. The old Three Sisters way her grandmother had planted, the way the seed's long ago maker had clearly intended, because why else label these three together? When the last seedling was in, June stood at the edge of the quarter acre and looked at the neat green rows where 6 weeks before there had been only frozen thistle, and she felt something she had no word for. It was not quite happiness. It was bigger and quieter than that. It was the feeling of having made a thing that would outlast the making of it. Then she heard the truck on the county road. The truck slowed at the fence line. June pulled Wesley down behind the thistle screen and watched through the dry stems as a man in a town coat climbed out and stood with his hands on his hips, surveying the field. Pruitt. He was not looking at the silo, he was looking at the green. Even from here, June could see his head turning, taking in the impossible rows where his abandoned thistle should have been. A field he had let die was suddenly alive, and men like Pruitt did not like questions they couldn't answer on land they considered theirs. He stood a long while. Then he got back in his truck and drove toward town, and June knew with a sinking certainty that he would be back with papers. He came back in 9 days, and he did not come alone. June was hoeing the bean rows when she heard 2 trucks this time. She had time only to send Wesley out the back through the thistle with a hissed instruction to say nothing to anyone, and then to set down her hoe and stand straight in the middle of a green field like she had every right to be there, which she had decided somewhere in those 9 days that she did. Pruitt climbed out of the first truck. A second man got out of the other, older, soft-handed, carrying a leather folder, a lawyer's folder. June had learned to recognize the tools of men like these the way she'd learned to recognize weather. "This is private property," Pruitt called across the fence. "Yes," June agreed. "I've been wondering whose," that stopped him for half a beat. He had expected a frightened drifter who would scatter at the sight of him. He had run her out of Ashfork in the fall with a few hard words. He had not expected her to be standing in a planted field looking at him as though he were the one who needed explaining. "It's mine," Pruitt said, recovering. "This whole quarter section. You're squatting, and you've been improving it without leave, which I could have the law on you for." He gestured at the soft-handed man. "Mr. Aldous here can show you the deed." Aldous opened his folder and produced a paper with the slow ceremony of a man who charged by the hour. He read from it a legal description of the land, a chain of ownership, Pruitt's name at the bottom. He read it the way Pruitt's kind always read documents at people like June. As a wall, a thing meant to end conversation, June listened. She had learned in the bunker's long, quiet evenings exactly how to listen to a document. The oilcloth manuals had taught her patience with dense language. The found ledger had taught her that columns of dull words could hide the most important things. So she did not flinch at the legal phrases. She waited for the seam. "May I see the date?" she asked. Aldous, surprised, held the paper up. June's stepped to the fence and read the description, and the date, and the words that came after, subject to existing easements and encumbrances of record. "There's an old dispute on this title," June said slowly. "Isn't there? That's why you let it go to Thistle." The lines tangled. Pruitt's face did something ugly. "The dispute's a technicality. Nobody's pressed it in 40 years. But it's of record," June said. "It says so right there, subject to encumbrances of record." She did not entirely know what she was doing. But she knew the shape of a weak spot the way she knew the smell of soil that would not hold a crop, and she pressed it. "If your title were clean, Mr. Pruitt, you'd have cleared the thistle and farmed it yourself years ago. You didn't, because you can't sell what you can't prove you fully own, and you can't risk improving land somebody might still come back and claim. So you let it sit, and you'd have let it sit another 40 years if I hadn't made it green." The lawyer Aldous was looking at Pruitt now with a new and careful expression. June had said something true enough to matter, and Aldous, who charged by the hour and protected his own name, did not want to stand in a field defending a deed that wouldn't hold. "Hollis," Aldous said quietly, "is the chain clear, or isn't it?" "It's clear enough to run off a vagrant," Pruitt snapped. But the certainty had gone out of him, and all three of them felt it go. June stood at her fence with her dirt-dark hands and her green rose behind her, and for the first time in 3 years she did not feel small. "I'm not a vagrant," she said. "I'm a farmer, and I think before you have any law on me, you'd best be very sure exactly what you own." Pruitt stared at her. Then he turned and told Aldous that they were leaving, but June saw before he masked it that she had frightened him. And frightened men are dangerous. She was right to think it. Pruitt did not come back with trucks. He came back, over the following weeks, with the slow, strangling pressure that was his real weapon. The way men with money and standing close in on people who have neither. First, the county sent a man about the silo. There was an ordinance, it turned out, against habitation of agricultural structures, and someone had filed a complaint. The man was apologetic. He could see June wasn't hurting anyone. But a complaint was a complaint, and he had to write her up. And if she was found living in the silo again, there'd be a fine she couldn't pay and a removal she couldn't stop. June thanked him politely and told him she was not living in the silo, which was technically true, since she was living beneath it. After he left, she sat a long while with the ledger and understood the new shape of the danger. Pruitt could not take her field outright. The tangled title saw to that, the encumbrance protecting her as much as it had ever protected him. But he could make her existence here illegal one ordinance at a time. He could fine her into nothing. He could wait for winter and the habitation rule and simply freeze her out. Then the supply pressure started. June had been quietly selling at the edges. Eggs from 3 hens she'd traded for, early greens, the surplus the quarter-acre threw off as summer came on. She sold to a few farm wives who didn't ask where a girl with no land got such good greens. It wasn't much, but it was real money, the first she'd earned that felt like a future. Then, one Saturday, the farm wives wouldn't meet her eye, and the little market stand at the crossroads turned her away. Pruitt owned the granary and the lumber yard and held paper on half the families in the county, and he had let it be known, in the quiet way such things are let known, that anyone trading with the girl at the broke silo would find their own credit gone short. It was masterful in its way. He never threatened June at all. He simply made it so the world around her closed, one door at a time, until she would have to leave of her own accord, and then he could clear the thistle, quiet the title with her gone and forgotten, and take the green field she'd made. Wesley took it hardest. "It's not fair," he said, fierce and near tears, the evening they realized the crossroads stand was closed to them. "You made all this, from nothing. And he didn't do anything. He couldn't finish." "He's got every card," June agreed quietly. "Money. The law. The whole county owing him." She turned a squash leaf over, checking its underside the way her grandmother had taught her, looking for the small troubles before they became large ones. "That's how it usually goes, Wes. The people who already have everything get to decide who's allowed to have anything." "Then we lose," Wesley said. June didn't answer right away. She was thinking. The cold practical part of her, the part that had inventoried 200 cans and tested 10 kernels and read a deed for its seam, that part was turning something over, the way you turn a strange tool in your hands until you understand what it's for. She thought about the man who had built the bunker. A frightened man, yes, but a careful one. A man who, in a frightened time, had not just hoarded, he had documented. The oilcloth manuals, the labeled tins, the crates stenciled with dates. He had been the kind of man who wrote things down, who kept records, who proved what he owned and what he'd done. And he had been here on this land in 1957. "Wes," she said slowly, "when you and your mother lost your farm, did anyone ever talk about the old families out here? About who had land before Pruitt's people did?" Wesley wiped his nose and looked at her. "There's old folks in town remember everything. Mrs. Ostrander at the church. She's about 100. Why?" June looked down into the dark square of the bunker hatch, where a frightened, careful man had sealed away proof of a whole way of living. "Because I think there might be records," she said. But before she could chase that thread, the cold closed in early. A hard freeze came the second week of September, weeks ahead of any frost June had ever known, the kind of killing cold that the old-timers would later call the worst in memory. She and Wesley worked through the night with every sheet of canvas the bunker held, covering what they could. It wasn't enough. By dawn, the bean vines hung black, and the squash leaves had collapsed to slime, and the corn stood scorched and bowed. The quarter-acre she had built from nothing, the green proof that she was a farmer and not a vagrant, was a field of frost-killed ruin. June stood in the gray light and felt the old smallness come back like cold water closing over her head. That night she did not make a list. She sat in the bunker with one lantern lit and the killed field above her and let herself feel, for the first time since her grandmother died, the full weight of how alone she was. Pruitt had not even needed to win. The weather had done it for him. She had let herself want, had broken her one rule, had reached for something, and the world had done what the world did to people like her, which was to take it back. She thought about leaving. It would be easy. Pack the canvas bag, climb the ladder, walk the county road, become weather again. She knew how. She was good at it. Wanting nothing had kept her alive for 3 years. And look what wanting something had gotten her. A frozen field, and a frightened boy, and a rich man who would have the law on her by spring. The lantern light fell on the shelf of seed tins, seed corn, seed bean, seed squash, the frightened, careful man's neat hand. He had been frightened, too. He had built this whole room out of fear that the world was ending. And yet June sat up slowly. He had filled it not with weapons but with seed, with the means to start over. He had not built a place to hide from the end. He had built a place to begin again after it. What looks like nothing is only nothing if you stop looking. She had a field. She had seed. She had not stopped looking. June stood up. The field was killed, but the seed lived. Tins of it more than she'd planted, enough to plant 10 fields. A frozen crop was a season lost. not a life, and a season was time. Time to do the thing she'd glimpsed before the freeze drove it out of her head. Records. The frightened, careful man had kept records because that was the kind of man he was. And men like Mrs. Ostrander remembered. If there were proof of who had truly held this tangled land, proof older and cleaner than Pruett's muddy deed, then the encumbrance that protected her might do far more than protect her. She climbed the ladder into the cold dawn and went to find the old woman who remembered everything, Mrs. Ostrander lived in a narrow house behind the church, and she was indeed very old, and her eyes were sharp as a hawk's. June came to her not as a beggar but as a farmer with a question, and the old woman, who had watched the county's powerful men close in on the weak for 80 years, listened with growing interest to the girl with dirt under her nails. The Vesper place, Mrs. Ostrander said, when June described the quarter section, the silo, the tangled title. That's the old Vesper place. Of course it's tangled. She folded her spotted hands. Walt Vesper. Now there was a man who saw things coming. Built half his life underground, they said, back in the scared years. People laughed at him. He didn't care. June's heart was beating hard. What happened to him? Died with no children and a will nobody could find. Land went into dispute. The county, a cousin back east, a bank. They argued so long the cousin died too, and the bank failed. And in all the confusion, Hollis Pruitt's father bought a tax claim on it for almost nothing and called it his. Mrs. Ostrander's mouth thinned. But a tax claim on disputed land isn't clean title. Everyone knew it. That's why the Pruitts never farmed it. They were waiting for everyone who remembered to die. She fixed June with her hawk's eyes. I haven't died yet. The will, June said. If Walt Vesper left a will, then the land went where he wanted it, and the tax claim's worth nothing, and Hollis Pruitt's been squatting on a lie for 40 years. The old woman almost smiled. But the will was never found, child. People looked. It wasn't in the house, wasn't with any lawyer in the county. Walt Vesper trusted nobody. If he wrote a will, he hid it somewhere only a careful, frightened man would think to put it. June sat very still. She thought of the bunker, the oilcloth manuals sealed against time, the crates of records. A careful, frightened man's neat hand on every tin, a place to begin again after the end. I think, June said slowly, I know where a man like that would hide the most important thing he owned. She did not tell Mrs. Ostrander about the bunker. Not all of it, not yet. But she asked one thing. If June found such a paper, would the old woman swear to what she knew, to Walt Vesper, to the dispute, to the worthless tax claim? I've been waiting 40 years for someone to ask me that, Mrs. Ostrander said. June went back to the field in the failing light and climbed down into the bunker, and this time she did not look at the seed or the cans or the tools. She looked at the workbench where a careful man would sit and at the steel cabinet bolted beside it that she had inventoried as tools Miskin never fully emptied. She took everything out, wrenches, files, a coil of fuse wire, and at the back, behind a false panel of painted steel that she only found because she ran her hands over every inch, the way her grandmother had taught her to find the swollen seam in a jar lid, a flat tin box sealed with wax. Her hands shook as she warmed the wax with the lantern and worked the lid free. Papers, crisp, oilcloth wrapped, perfect. A deed to the quarter section in the name of Walter Vesper, clean and recorded. And folded with it, in a careful hand she had come to know better than any living person's, a will. Walt Vesper, being of sound mind, having no family worth the name, left his land and all upon and beneath it to whoever should come and work it honestly when he was gone. For he had built it, he wrote, not to die in, but so that some future soul with more need than luck might begin again. June read it twice in the lantern light. Then she sat down on the concrete floor and cried, which she had not done since her grandmother's funeral, and they were not sad tears. The rest moved quickly. The way things do once, a single true fact is set loose among people who have been waiting for it. June took the will and the deed to a lawyer 2 counties over, a young one with no debt to Pruitt, who read the papers and Mrs. Ostrander's sworn statement and grew very excited in the quiet way of a man who sees a clear case. Walt Vesper's will was valid. It had been hidden, not lost. Its terms were strange but lawful, and June Halloway had done exactly what it required. She had come, and she had worked the land honestly, and there were a frozen field and a ledger full of careful columns and a boy named Wesley to prove it. Hollis Pruitt's tax claim, set against a true recorded will, was exactly what Mrs. Ostrander had called it, a 40-year lie. He fought it, of course. Men like Pruitt always fight. But he was fighting a dead man's clear intention, an old woman's iron memory, and a girl who had learned to read a document for its seam. The county, embarrassed, was eager to be rid of the old dispute. By the first snow, the quarter section was June's. Not squatted, not borrowed, but hers, deeded and recorded, the encumbrance resolved at last in favor of the one person who had ever done what Walt Vesper asked. Pruitt's power, it turned out, had been built on the same tangled, dishonest foundation as his claim. Once one lie was pulled loose, the farmwives remembered, they liked the girl with the good greens, and the crossroads stand reopened to her, and the families who owed Pruitt paper began, quietly, to wonder what else he'd taken that wasn't his. June stood in her field on the first clear day of the new year, her field, the words still strange and wonderful, with Wesley beside her and the broke silo behind them, and the whole frozen quarter section waiting under the snow. Beneath their feet, the bunker held seed enough for 10 springs. "What looks like nothing," June said softly to her grandmother, to Walt Vesper, to the boy, to herself, "is only nothing if you stop looking." Wesley grinned. "So what do we plant first?" Spring came late, but it came, and on a warm morning in May, June Halloway knelt in dark living soil and set a single seed potato into the ground. She was not hiding now. The silo behind her had a new roof and a mended door, and smoke rose from a proper stovepipe, and a hand-painted sign at the county road read Vesper Farm. Seed and produce in Wesley's careful letters. Mrs. Ostrander sat in a chair in the sun. Farm wives came and went. The field that everyone had walked past for 40 years was green to its edges and getting greener. June pressed the soil firm over the seed and sat back on her heels, looking at the small nothing she had just planted, knowing exactly what it would become.